Hello and welcome to Shep's Chat 204, still Chapter 2 in the Constitution. When we left off last time, we were talking about the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists and how they were trying to get the Constitution either ratified if they were Federalists or not ratified if they were Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists had a little bit easier of a task because they were sticking to the status quo. So the Federalists had to convince people that this whole new form of government was the way to go, while the Anti-Federalists were still stuck on the Articles of Confederation, trying to say, we can just adapt those. We can make those work. The Federalists have to sell to people and say, this whole new type of government is going to be what saves the day. The Anti-Federalists did not have the same power that the Federalists had. They didn't have the ability to communicate or access to the newspapers in the same way the Federalists did. So the Anti-Federalists are able to get their message out there, but it's not as clear and it's not as strong. How do the Federalists market it? Well, they write the Federalist Papers. Those are done over a year-long period from 1787 to 1788, and they are printed primarily in the newspapers in New York, but then they're copied everywhere for people throughout all 13 states to see. There are 85 different essays that talk about the American political theory, and some are long, some are short, all are pretty boring, but what they do is they set up the way that our government is going to function for the next 200 plus years. And a lot of those things aren't even found specifically in the Constitution, and yet we still rely on them. The idea of judicial review, not found anywhere in the Constitution, but it is found in one of the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers are written by Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison. Those are the three authors. Most of them are written by Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. If you want the specific numbers for how many each wrote, you can ask Abby because I think she has it memorized. All right, marketing for the Anti-Federalist Papers, or the replies to the Federalist Papers. Those were written primarily by Montezuma and a group that called themselves the Philadelphianists. And they're aristocrats that are afraid of tyranny. They are trying to remind us that we just broke away from the king. We don't want to go back to that. If you think back to Brutus, it's the idea of how can one national government know what everybody in the United States needs? We're all radically different in their ideas, countries at this time. They think that having this type of government would hinder their liberty and their freedoms, which is one of the reasons why they broke away from Great Britain. And they feel like they need a guarantee of their rights. Nowhere in the Constitution do you have any rights until it comes to the Bill of Rights, which is after the Constitution is written. So they feel it needs a guarantee of rights. Now, what do the standard people of society think about this? The average everyday Joe, what does he think about the new Constitution? Well, he's probably going to think it's kind of an elitist theory, because if you think about it, a bunch of rich white men just overthrew your government. So the idea that they're founding fathers and that they're important and that they're so smart and that they did this back then would not have felt the same way for a lot of people. All of a sudden, they didn't have Articles of Confederation anymore. Now they have something called the Constitution. And it didn't really get everybody's voice heard. It gets some people's voice heard, but normally just the loudest people in the room. So what does it that we get this new Constitution ratified? Is it Madison and Hamilton's strong arguments? Is it just how bad the Articles of Confederation really stunk? It's neither of those things. It's actually the fact that they compromise once again and they come up with the Bill of Rights, which you can think of as a Bill of Limits, because that basically says this is what the government can't do. You have the right to do this and the government can't stop you from doing it. All right, the Bill of Rights, written by James Madison, also the writer of the Constitution, and they are the first 10 amendments. He had 12 of them, only 10 of them are approved, and they are written and ready to be included into the Constitution even before it is officially ratified. They are not in the Constitution because Madison felt pretty strongly that they weren't needed. He kind of says, guys, if we put in that we have this right, and this right, then the government could say, well, those are the only three rights you have. And that's really not the case. And they wanted to make sure that didn't happen. But the strength of the Anti-Federalists and saying, well, we're not going to sign the Constitution then, is the reason why we insist, or why they insist, that there are specific rights outlined at the end of the Constitution. And that is your Bill of Rights. The whole Constitution, as it's written, is short and to the point. And that's for a purpose. It's intended to be interpreted by posterity. We wanted to be able to change it. We want to be able to let it grow. The state constitutions are 49 of them, much longer. There's one shorter one. But the U.S. Constitution, short, to the point, the outline of the government, what is it supposed to do? It has been expanded on since then and interpreted since then, but the actual Constitution is very short. So I want to amend it. How do I go about doing that? Well, It's a living, breathing document is how we consider it. So it can be changed. It can be updated to fit the needs of the time. The way that you go about doing this is 2/3 of Congress or 2/3 of the state legislature propose an amendment, and then you have to vote on it. It demonstrates the federal structure, the way it starts. So you propose the amendment, you can propose it through the states, or you can propose it through the federal government. Both have a power when it comes to amending this Constitution. So this shows the standard way for proposing an amendment. If you look at the purple line, it normally starts with 2/3 of a vote in both chambers of Congress saying this is a good idea and this is what we should do. And then the legislatures of 3/4 of the state coming together and approving the amendment. So the amendment is taken by 2/3 of Congress, and then 3/4 of the state legislature say, yep, this sounds like a plan. The only time this didn't happen is when they repeal the 18th Amendment, which is the Prohibition Amendment, and that's because the dry states, their legislatures were very, very, very committed to remaining dry. So they go to convention where there's people. We have not had a national convention called by Congress for an amendment. The last time they did it, they overthrew the government. That's probably going to make them a little bit more nervous about having a national convention. There have been 11,000 amendments that have been proposed. Of those 11,000, only 27 have been ratified. So it's clearly not very easy. And 10 of those were ratified before we actually get the Constitution. The Constitution cannot be amended over long periods of time. So you propose an amendment, you don't get eternity to decide whether you're going to have that amendment. Most of the time, the court system limits that. In many cases, that averages out to about 7 years. In the case of the last amendment, the 27th Amendment, that actually took 203 years for that amendment to pass. And the reason for that is it was one of the original amendments that Madison had wanted in the Constitution, and it wasn't included. So it takes until a few years ago for that to happen. All right, these are the amendments to the Constitution. The first 10 being the Bill of Rights, the next 17 being extremely important. You will need to know what those are. Hi, James. And have a very basic understanding of each one of them as it gets closer to the end of your test. We will go over them in more detail in the near future. All right, there are also some informal ways to amend the Constitution. The legislative branch has broad powers to create laws, courts, and agencies. So nowhere in there does it say, we talked about marijuana, that they can control marijuana use. However, they have the power to control interstate commerce, and they use their implied powers to get more power for them. The executive branch can enter into executive agreements, and during wartime, their wartime powers are expanded. The judicial branch examines the constitutionality of laws. They have the ability to interpret the Constitution and determine what's legal and what's not legal. This is nowhere technically in the Constitution. However, Federalist 78, which was part of the Federalist Papers, does talk about this, and that becomes official policy in Marbury v. Madison. So, before we close, important topics to hit again. Know the fundamentals of the Constitution. So you can go back to this one: popular sovereignty, republican government, limited government with written laws, separation of powers and checks and balances, a federal system that divides power between the national and state. You need to know these principles. They are extremely important. Just a minute. Let me go back. Okay. All right. You need to know about checks and balances. You need to know ways that the Constitution allows each branch to make sure that there is no tyranny of the other branches. We don't want any branch to be able to overpower the other branches. It's an equal weighted system. So we think of Congress as being the most important, but it doesn't have any power over the other branches. And then the last one is how to propose an amendment. And we are going to go over this in a little bit more detail. Last couple of days of class, you're going to propose an amendment. We're going to try to get it passed. But that's pretty much wraps up chapter 2. All right, thanks guys, bye.